Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laurel Loke, and I'm the Parish Administrator at St. George's Episcopal Church. On behalf of our panelists, welcome. We're so glad that you were able to join us for our discussion today. Before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes to share with you. Our discussion today is part of our Lenten weekend celebration, and the programming is offered free of charge. But if you would like to make a donation to help support us in our mission of encouraging conversation and encouraging growth and fellowship with one another, then please visit stgeorgesepiscopal.net/giving and select Lenten Weekend from the fund drop-down. And this is how you can make a gift online. We are recording today's discussion. We will post the recording on our website, and also you'll receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email. If you would like to interact with other participants throughout the conversation today, then please use the chat window to send messages back and forth. Our discussion today will have time at the end for a Q&A with the panelists. If you have a question for one or all of the panelists at any time during the discussion, then please use the Q&A window to send your question. We will get through as many questions as we have time for today. And that's all I have for you today. I would now like to take this opportunity to turn the conversation over to our rector, Joe Hensley, who is also moderating today's panel discussion. Thank you very much. Joe?
Thank you so much, Laurel, and thank you to Laurel, especially for all the behind the scenes work that you've been doing during and before this Lenten weekend. Appreciate all your help. So welcome everyone to our session today, the kind of concluding session of our Lenten weekend, which started yesterday with a wonderful retreat by Brothers Luke and Brother Lucas of the Society of St. John the Evangelist, as we began to explore our theme of storytelling and the power of storytelling. And they led us through some ways in which we were engaging our own story and engaging with the stories of Scripture yesterday morning and yesterday afternoon. And we've had sermons for young people as well as for adults this morning offered by them, and a wonderful forum discussion. And this conversation is kind of designed to be kind of the capstone of the weekend, in which we are kind of looking at the story of our St. George's community. And this ties in with the fact that we are in the midst of a celebration of our 300th anniversary as a parish, which unfortunately due to COVID has been a little different than we might have imagined, but we're still carrying on. And so we started this celebration last spring, and we'll continue at least through this spring and really beyond. We're just going to keep on going so that we can get all the celebrating done that we want to get done. And so we made the theme of our Lenten weekend this year about stories, with the idea that we're doing a lot of storytelling about St. George's. Especially now. We've had a history committee hard at work on researching some of that history and stories. And I thought about, well, so then what do we need to do to get into this together? And I said, I just want to have a conversation with some friends of St. George's who could each bring a different perspective to this discussion. And so we've gathered this sort of motley crew, a wonderful group of guests that I will introduce to you now. And I'm so thankful to each one of you for the relationships that we have, and Brother Luke that we have newly formed as you've been our guest this weekend. So I'm going to just read a little bit about each of our panelists and then kind of start our discussion. So I'm going to start with Malanna Henderson. Malanna Carey Henderson is an author and playwright, and she's been a parishioner at St. George's since 2007. She works with the University of Mary Washington as a docent for the Gary Melchers Home and Studio Museum. Last December, she published her first book, a historical fiction work titled On the Wings of Freedom, set in 1860. She's also produced historical plays for the Friends of the Wilderness Battlefield program, Untold Stories. And some of those were staged here at St. George's. And she has an upcoming play, Give Us the Vote, which focuses on Virginia suffragists. And that'll be presented on YouTube as part of UMW's event celebrating Women's History Month in March. And Malanna is also part of our St. George's History Committee. So I was excited to invite her as a storyteller and a lover of history to be part of the conversation today. John Hennessy has been a member of the Fredericksburg community for 26 years. He's the chief historian at our national park here, the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. During his tenure, he's worked to expand the range of stories told by the park to include the experiences of civilians, enslaved people, as well as soldiers, and to demonstrate the relevance of the Civil War era to Americans of today. And having been to some of his interpretive sessions where we were walking around Fredericksburg, I can attest to the fact that he is a great storyteller. And so I'm excited for you, John, to bring some of your knowledge of the wider story of this region, as well as your, you've done programs at St. George's too about our history here. Reverend Oshin Jennings is the founder and leader of No Barrier Zen, a Zen Buddhist temple in Washington, D.C. Oshin is the first known deaf Buddhist monk, and he has made it his mission to use his experiences as a deaf and disabled practitioner to help make meditation practice and the Buddhist teachings accessible to all people, especially those with historically limited access. Oshin uses his more than 20 years of formal Zen training along with his experiences as a psychotherapist and artist to create warm, dynamic, and inclusive practice environments that are supportive of all minds and bodies. And some of you may remember that Oshin was our guest for the Lenten weekend 2 years ago. And I wanted to invite Oshin into this conversation. Oshin's become a friend. And I think Oshin also brings an appreciation of St. George's commitment to being welcoming and to being more accessible, even as we have more work to do in that effort, that area. And that St. George's has had a long tradition of being a congregation that likes to be in dialogue with other faith communities. And that's an important part of our story. So welcome, Oshin. And finally, I'm sort of saving him for last, even though he's been familiar to many of you this weekend, Brother Luke Ditewig. After serving much at a camp on a desert island once upon a time, I'm sure that's a really interesting story you could tell us at some point. Brother Luke finds the monastery like an adult silent camp. He grew up in Orange County, California, studied in Boston and Princeton, and served a parish in Western Nebraska before coming to the Society of St. John the Evangelist in 2009. They are a monastic community of men in the Episcopal Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He currently helps lead that community as the Deputy Superior. And he loves long walks in the woods or on the beach, making snow angels, creating welcoming spaces with simple beauty, and ushering guests into holy rest and play. And just a word about myself. I am Rector of St. George's. I've been here since 2015. I am the 27th Rector of St. George's in its 300-year history. And when I am having free time, or shall I say, I enjoy in my time, I really love gathering with others in the community in St. George's, but also beyond. I've been a part of gathering a group of interfaith leaders once a month. I love exploring our Fredericksburg community, just walking and biking around and trying to find new places to explore. And I also really like climbing trees. So there's a little bit more about me that you may not have known before. So welcome to all our panelists. And we've sort of had some questions that we've been playing around with, and we would love to hear questions from our audience as well as we get going. I'm going to start us off with a question which is really kind of not just about St. George's, but about community in general. And that is, why tell stories as a community? Why do communities need to tell their stories? How can telling a story of a community be a powerful thing? And what do you all think we should keep in mind as we decide what to share and as we decide how to share it? Brother Luke, you want to get us started on this one?
Thank you, Joe. Yes, that's a good question to begin with. Well, we tell stories as individuals, but we usually tell stories in community. I will tell a story of my experience to someone else, both for a way for me to capture and come to understand what has happened to me, and to form relationship with you. Because I will tell you my story, and then I'll also ask for what you heard in it. You may ask me clarifying questions. You may tell me a similar experience that you've had. And you'll also tell me stories of your experience, which are similar or different to mine. So stories are community making. And it's how we become community. But then it's also, as you raise here, helpful for communities themselves to tell stories of who are we? What have we experienced? And it's a way for us to make meaning of who we are by what has happened. That's true for all kinds of communities, and certainly for communities of faith, as we have in our scriptures many stories of what has happened to us, what has shaped us. And even in those stories, often in scripture, we're encouraged to keep telling the stories. God says to the ancient Israelites, tell these things to your children and to your grandchildren. Pass this on and tell them like what these stones mean. In this case, we built an altar, we built a monument, and it's not simply to build it, but a story needs to be retold of what happened here at this point. And that story will live for generations. So it shapes us, and it's important just for who we are to keep telling them. You also ask, so how do we tell these things? Or what should we pay attention to? It's important to have someone who can be receptive to the story, who can listen or witness well. So it might vary as to the time and place of what stories for what context, so that it can be heard and fully acknowledged. And so some stories may be best told in a larger context. Some stories might be best told in a smaller context. Some stories are fun and easy and can be told on the spot, including like between us who may not know each other well. Other stories are more vulnerable. And so building trust, whether with how long we've been together or setting up norms for how to receive something that's difficult, is important for that which is more vulnerable, so that one can both share honestly and it can be received and in a healthy and whole way. And it's important, as with some of our other questions, to have those spaces, because sometimes what is difficult, we then have chosen not to tell. And not telling, or intentional or intentional to have secrets, can hurt a community. So finding spaces to tell the harder things, to take some more intentionality for it to be safe and to be heard, especially when including stories about how we have been hurt or how we have hurt others.
Yeah, I like that. That's very helpful to think about the different layers and depth of stories. We've been talking about conversations in the parish. A consultant gave us this idea of there's front porch information, there's living room information, and there's kitchen table information. And so particularly about finances, we've been talking about that, but I think there's something to be said there too. There's sort of the stories that we would tell on our website to the whole world. And then there are stories that are better told, like in the context of the living room once someone has arrived in the space. And then there are other stories that's like, you really need to be around the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, to make sure that's helpful. It's helpful. Anybody else resonate, John?
I'm going to go at this a little bit from the historiographical side of things, history. Like our own memories, our kind of the construction of our past, our memory of our collective past is sometimes graceful, sometimes not very graceful mixture of remembering stories and forgetting stories. And the stories that are told and that carry on are those that come from voices that we are willing to hear. And one of the great challenges in this community, of course, is that many of us in this community have been unwilling to hear certain stories over the years. And as Brother Luke mentioned, the collateral damage of silence is incredible. I mean, we've witnessed this in our community very dramatically in the last year, of silence, of forgetting, of choosing not to hear. And when you choose not to hear for very long, of course, those voices eventually come roaring back to claim their space. So it's vitally important to remember that stories are not our history. They're part of our history, but they are not just our. I mean, you can find a story, you can find a voice to justify any idea in the universe, pretty much. The challenge for us is to take those stories and understand them in a continuum of our society and how they fit in, how they offend, how they inform, and how they can inspire us as well. They're all those things. And we like the ones that inspire us. We tend to be pretty cautious about those that are cautionary or suggest to us that, well, maybe that wasn't the right route for us to take. But for stories to succeed, we have to recognize that the voice matters. We have to be willing to hear, and we have to understand these stories in a much bigger continuum.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. Thank you. Yeah, the difference between history and story is interesting. And this was something that when I came here as rector in 2015, people immediately put it on my radar screen that we were going to be celebrating this 300th anniversary. And ever since, I've been thinking about, okay, what do we need to do in order to both make sure we've accurately recounted our history and also included more stories? Because a lot of what I was handed was like a list of rectors and dates and actions of the vestry, which aren't very story-like, but then you've got a lot of stories that are kind of in between the lines. So I think that kind of, oh, go ahead, Melina.
Yeah, I just want to say that Jesus used parables, stories, to spread the faith and to gather people and all, so they can understand faith and all. So in a similar way, writers do the same thing. We have a premise or something that we believe in. So we find a plot and characters to create a story that we think people should hear, or to teach certain aspects about history or point of view that we believe in.
And you have to be you have to be an editor too, because you can't tell. It's like, what do you tell and what do you not tell? Important details. And Jesus, you're right. Jesus used stories. I mean, the Bible is a story of a community, and the story of God's chosen people in community over many centuries. And it's like, you know, and then it's interesting to think what they chose to tell and what they didn't choose to tell in that story. So, I mean, John, you said some stories offend, some stories inform, some stories inspire. You know, and one of the things that I'm hoping out of our 300th anniversary is that the way we tell our story can be life changing, not only for people individually, but for our community. There's a transformational aspect to a community telling its story. And Oshin, I wonder if you could sort of maybe give us some thoughts on what makes a community's story transformative.
Yes, thank you. What a powerful question to sit with. Really, really, truly amazing. What first arose for me when I was sitting with this question is, you know, what makes a story transformative is I don't know. I don't know. And I think that's powerful too. I think the process that we can get very involved in and committed to can sometimes crowd out other voices and other stories. So from a kind of more Zen perspective, we often sit with this not knowing in a contemplative way. How do we open ourselves up? And I think that's such a powerful message in Lent as well. How do we empty ourselves out this way so that we can be open-handed and receive? So it's not a cop-out answer. It's a contemplative answer. I don't know. From this space of not knowing, I can stay open and I can listen to the story that's there. I can make room for my story, for the story of others, and not become so fixed or static in my story, in my beliefs, in somebody else's story, even, because it's always evolving. It's ever evolving. That story is always being written. And I think I see this a lot as a therapist as well, because in therapy, we tell stories. We organize ourselves these ways on the very individual level. This is how I relate to others and myself. And we always have to kind of meet it up with not getting too stuck in our own stories and giving them room to breathe and to grow. And also seeing what stories that I have, to bounce off what John said, this idea that some of my stories or my silences, they can crowd out other stories. And also, I was just really inspired with what Brother Luke said. I always find it to be what's transformative about stories is the inner part between community and individual. Community and individual. The community holds those values and those stories for us. And in this case, the gospel. The stories here are the gospel. And the community also has to make room for including all people, the whole person and their stories. And when somebody feels seen and heard, they feel like they belong. And in that belonging, they can participate in the community fully. How do we tend to all of that? How do we tend to all those parts of ourselves and the stories of our communities is a big question. And that's a good thing. Allowing it to be a big question, allowing it to be active, not feeling like, oh, we already had the discussion. We had that story discussion and we drew a line and this is where we are now. But it's an engagement that we have to keep coming back to. And then the individual feeling seen and heard feels more empowered to go out into the wider community. But they can always have that touchstone of their faith community, in this instance, the St. George's community, and then they can go out with that empowerment. And it often sounds like I'm a proud St. Georgian and this and that, and this is the way I belong, and this is how I hold these stories. They become, in turn, they feel stronger, wiser, more empowered. And it's a feedback loop between the individual and the community. And it goes back and forth like that. I find this often, I do a lot of restorative justice work, and the themes are very similar there as well. We always look at the participants, who's allowed at the table, who can have a story, who's a stakeholder here. We look at the truthfulness of stories. We look at what is core to stories. We also, one of the other qualities is we look at how safe and respectful it can be. That always comes back to that. And for me, that's inclusion as well. Again, who can be at the table? Who can tell these stories? Who can feel welcomed at the table? You know, here again, we have a deaf Buddhist monk talking on a Lenten panel. I love it. I love it. I love this openness to each other's stories. It's powerful. And then, of course, always in transformative justice, the commitment to repair and at the end. So it's always circling back, individual and community, and we're always moving through these things and carrying that story forward.
Oh, thank you. I love just the permission not to know. Thank you for that. I think that's really important, and that of course means so much from coming from the Zen perspective. I think it's a good reminder that we don't have to have it all figured out. What I heard you talk about was a lot of just this idea of, in order for a community story to be transformative, the community has to be transforming. The community has to be moving. The community has to be changing in some way. And those are the stories that move us the most, are the ones where we see something go from one way to another way. And then we tell that story, and wasn't that and that then motivates us or connects us in our transformation and healing. Anybody else want to respond to that question, John?
Just very quickly, I mean, one of the hardest parts about this is that it's a generational effort. It's not this week, next month, next year. It's generations. The things that separate us are rooted in centuries, and we're not going to solve them with a program here or a program there. Years ago, I was involved in the planning of a service of reconciliation, and Janice Davies was there, Reverend Davies' wife. And she came up to me afterwards and she put her hand on my face. And she said, "Do you know how many services of reconciliation I've been to in my years in Fredericksburg?" And she said, what matters is not the service. What matters is what happens after the service of reconciliation, and that continuing effort and getting to the point where you don't need services of reconciliation anymore. And that was one of the more memorable lessons of my career, is this idea of persistence and consistency. And, you may have 10 people attend something. Well, if you only have 10 people attend something, you can do it 1,000 times, and then you might start making a difference. And so it really requires that kind of persistence and determination to continually do the right thing.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I think that later on we want to talk more about how then we can tell those stories with humility, like, oh, we had this one reconciliation service, aren't we great? But it takes, it's a generational work. And just Brother Luke Lawrence Davies was Fredericksburg's first African-American mayor, served for over 20 years. And his wife Janice has also been just an important person in the community in terms of change and justice and just beloved saints of Fredericksburg.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Malanna.
Yeah, I just wanted to say how community is made up of different individuals, and they have a shared history because they're in the community. And like members of the church, we're different people with different experiences, but the history of St. George's is something that we have in common. So it becomes our history because it's our church. We current members are like living history of the church. We will leave our mark on it in varying ways as the people who came before us. So in that respect, it's transformative from individuals to the whole church community and back and forth.
Yeah, and that kind of relates a little bit to what you were saying, Brother Luke, in the first question, just about how the stories have these different levels. You know, there's our, and that we tell stories individually to make meaning, but our individual stories are part of a larger story. And sometimes I think we often tell individual stories as if they were a community story too. We'll tell the story of an individual who was particularly inspiring, and then we're like, yes, that person was a St. Georgian, and we sort of feel like their story is somehow our story. Malanna, I wonder if when you came to St. George's, what were some of the stories that inspired you?
Well, I took the Pilgrim class, and they said that Martin Luther King was a saint in his church. I'm like, oh, wow. So I was impressed with that, the recognition, even though he's a Baptist, but the church recognized him as a saint, someone who gave their lives for equality, humanity's sake, too. So I was really impressed with that. And the music, I love the music. And the adult forum, we get a chance to get to know each other. A lot of churches I've been to before, we have coffee hour, but you don't really talk about anything, significant, or it's not a collective conversation. So I really appreciate that. So I was impressed with that.
That's a story that is told about St. George's in the community now, is that, we're a welcoming place, a place that values the contributions, and the Episcopal Church in general, of a wide variety of people, but that, St. George's in particular it is said of St. George's that, we are very hospitable and welcome people well. I as a member of our history committee, are there stories from our past that have gotten your attention as being particularly sort of inspiring?
Oh, yes. As you know, recently I did information or research and spoke about Joseph Walker last Sunday. So I found him humble in status at first glance, but so much more. He was a sexton from this church from 1886 to 1940. In white society, his ambitions were confined to manual labor. However, in the Black community, he was a deacon, a church leader, chairman of the board of the first Black high school. So his life could be shaped by his ambitions without the restraints of racial discrimination. In that respect, his life shows that Black people had two identities. One identity imposed upon them through the lens of racial discrimination, and the other identity developed from their own unique gifts and characteristics. So he used his many attributes to navigate successfully between the two worlds. He was highly respected and had genuine friendships on both sides of the aisle. So I'm not done yet. Okay, another story that inspired me was that took place when the Union Army occupied Fredericksburg in the 1860s. I quote, a Union artillerist described a companion soldier's attempt to destroy St. George's clock. Asking my friend why he had failed in his threatened demolition of the clock tower at St. Joseph Church, he replied that he watched the first shot he fired at it flying, as he thought, straight for the mark, but that before reaching the dial, the shell visibly swerved to the right and only clipped a corner of the tower. The second shot was never aimed at the clock at all. He said he experienced such a change of feeling that nothing could have induced him to harm it. So I was really, impressed by that. And present day stories of our history are exemplified in our outreach programs that the church supports, the table that feeds the poor. We have various domestic ministries. Also, our ministries abroad, past and present, like in Haiti and Honduras. And a few people like Larry Duffy, Cheryl Bryant, Janice Brunson, and others have given their time and talents to go to these foreign lands. In our adult forums, they give us educational and spiritual opportunity to ponder the questions of today. We have an occasion to tell our stories and share our opinions, a transformative activity which enriches and broadens our perspectives. So that's what I have to say about that.
Thanks, Malanna. Thanks for reminding us of some of the, I mean, there's internal stories, you know, like, I mean, inside St. George's, we talk about like how great the forums are, and we talk about, you know, and then there are these like wider stories like the clock tower story, which I've heard told before, and I'm always kind of like, that's right, God was looking out for St. George's.
Right.
You know, and I wonder, those of you who are not insiders of St. George's, I'm curious what stories you've been able to pick up that might have gotten your attention. Go ahead, John.
First screw up of the day. Won't be the last, I'm sure. And that was the best thing I was going to say all day, I'm sure. Just went into my room. One thing that strikes me isn't an individual story, but the continuum of stories of St. George's. You know, the female charity school, the male charity school, Mary Washington's Hospital. Just all of this is, you know, we talk about generational efforts, and those represent generational efforts, you know, starting in 1830s on up and beyond, and even before that, of course. So that's the one thing that I've always been impressed by. And each of the churches in Fredericksburg has a similar history, but I see St. George's fingers in more things than anybody else's, and you know, the folks down the street might get a little upset at saying that, but I mean, St. George's really does have something to be proud of in terms of its community engagement and trying to uplift elements of the community that need uplifting. And, you know, that's a tangible legacy that survives to this day.
And I, when I arrived here, I realized what, you know, I was standing on shoulders of shoulders, you know, and that, you know, when people praise St. George's, I always had to say, well, I really don't know how much I had to do with that, but it's good to be here, and it's good to be a part of seeing it continue. So I think that this is maybe you know, that there's these great stories that we tell, you know, that sort of are really exciting and inspiring about St. George's or about people that have been associated with St. George's. Then there are stories that are more painful, stories that you know, that we might even be divided about as a community about how we tell those stories. You know, so one of the stories that I learned was that, you know, St. George's helped to educate enslaved children during the colonial period, which on the one hand was a good thing, that children were being educated. On the other hand, the church did not stand up for the freedom of people, but cooperated with a system of human enslavement. And unfortunately, that school only stayed open for a few years because it eventually there wasn't enough support from the wider community for educating enslaved children. And so while we tell that story and say, well, St. George's did this, I mean, it was really only less than a decade. You know, and that, you know, former rectors, the longest serving rector of St. George's was himself a slave owner, participated, I mean, in our human, you know, it's sort of hard to say it, you know, but participated in the economic exchange of human beings, right? And so that's a painful thing to admit about a community. So how do we address these stories? the fact that in the, you know, during until the 1950s, and the Reverend Tom Faulkner, my predecessor, you know, the church was mostly segregated in its membership. How do we hold these kinds of stories, and what impact should they have on our greater story going forward? You know, I've sort of wrestled with how much of these are the front porch stories, or the living room stories, or the kitchen table stories. John is a historian, and as, you know, someone who's thought a lot about this in relationship to the work you do with the battlefield and everything. I wonder kind of if you want to get us started on this.
If ever there's an issue of our time, this is it. You know, one of the things that I often urge kind of myself to do, and as kind of a starting point, because it's a very difficult issue. There is tremendous virtue in our community every day. And in 1954, Fredericksburgers thought there was tremendous virtue in their community every day. We can look back now and say, okay, well, there was virtue, but there was a lot of other stuff too that we wish were not there. And you know what? In 70 years, our grandchildren are going to look back on us and say, what were you guys thinking? What did you see? I mean, not even our grandchildren, our children come to us and say, you know, what were you thinking? Why? What's the problem with gay people? I'm sorry. Can you tell me what that was? How was that? And how does that reflect on our society? So I think it's important for us to remember that, you know, we always, every generation disapproves of the generation before it as being antiquated and out of date. And every generation disapproves of the generation that follows as being sure to ride us to ruin, for sure. Our children inevitably will do that, of course, won't they? Because it's never happened, actually, of course. But that's our fear. But, you know, I think in kind of going at these stories, we need to make some distinction between remembering history, which again is kind of how we understand these stories in our larger national or community story, and honor. When we choose to honor something, by remembering, I mean, we all want to be remembered, of course, and remembering can be a form of honor. But when we choose to remember something, that doesn't necessarily mean we honor it. You know, we remember hard places like the battlefields or Auschwitz. But I think where we start running into trouble is when we consider, okay, what do we in the present, or what did our predecessors choose to honor within our society, within our landscape? And of course, the things that we value and how we understand our present and eventually our past changes so radically over time that, of course, the things that we choose to honor in 1890 are not going to be the things we choose to honor in 2021. It's just simply impossible. We would be a derelict, retrograde society if that were the case. And then separating that from history, you know, you often hear, okay, well, you're erasing history. Well, we're not. Choosing whom you honor or choosing not to honor is not erasing history. It doesn't erase those stories. It doesn't erase our understanding of how they fit into a continuum. And so we see that in our community now. Really, yes, it is about those stories we choose to tell, but the hardest part right now are the stories and people and places we choose to honor. And that is a very difficult question for people. You know, we live in a world of simplicities when it comes to history. Most people know very little about history beyond the basic rubric of 4th, 5th, 6th grade. Some go beyond that, but, you know, George Washington cut down a cherry tree, but he never told a lie. You know, baseball is America's pastime. Well, it maybe was, it's not so much anymore. We love these truisms, and these truisms take form in the form of monuments as well. Very simple representations of the way we wish things were, and they almost never are a faithful reflection of the way the things were. Or nor do they necessarily represent the values that we share in a society today. So we need to accept that we understand our past differently. In fact, we should celebrate that we understand our past differently. We should celebrate that what we honor in 1890 is not what we honor today or in 1954. It's critically important that that's true. And we need to allow for conversations about how that question of honoring our past fits into our present. And more importantly, how it reflects the power dynamic in our society at the time the honor was accorded. You know, in 1890, when Robert E. Lee went up on Monument Avenue, African American voices, they were out there, but they were unheard. And so you see that all along. And so now we have part of the challenge in our society today is that the voices that we're hearing and choosing to hear, or sometimes being forced to hear, is growing so rapidly. You know, our memory used to be embodied on art and in caves, you know, and over time it's accelerated, it's expanded, but it's really only in the last 100 years, charitably, 60 or 70 years, really, that the chorus of voices that we're willing to listen to has really expanded. And of course, that's going to affect what we as a society choose to honor. And so we need to be ready for those conversations, and they're hard conversations. You know, St. George's has, every institution that's more than 50 years old has those issues. And so it's a very interesting question, but I would go at it with empathy for those whose voices were not heard, but also with this perspective that we live in a society that we think is progressing. You know, we're working our hardest to make it better, I think, all of us. And yet in 70 or 80 years, our descendants are going to look back and say, holy cow, what a bunch of nincompoops they were. Because that's the way the world works. So we need to be mindful of that as well. And we're not bad people. We're not evil people. You know, many of our missteps are not necessarily rooted in evil. Sometimes they're rooted in ignorance more than evil. So it's a great challenge for any organization. It's a great challenge for our nation. And you can see how difficult that conversation is for our nation. But change is hard. And when you challenge one of those simplicities, when you challenge Robert E. Lee on a pedestal on Monument Avenue in Richmond, you know, people, you're challenging some of the fundamental beliefs that people have been brought up with their whole entire lives. And again, back to the generational thing, it's a generational process, but it's also an organizational challenge for all of us, be it in government or in St. George's Church.
Yeah, this is not just a St. George's issue for sure. And right. I think the word empathy is really important. I like the challenge, the difference between honoring and remembering, all very important. Malanna, do you want to give us some thoughts
about statues and such?
No, just about how does a community like ours or any community kind of what role do these painful stories have to play in telling our larger story, and how should we go about that?
Well, we can see how far we've come. Mm-hmm. And, you know, like McGuire, Reverend McGuire is a slaveholder. That's fact. It's something we shouldn't deny or anything. So I think, you know, because he was a rector, it's not wrong to have some sort of significant, you know, like a picture of him or something like that, because he was here and he held the position. But we've moved past that. And the church is a private property. It's not out, you know, if we got a statue of him out on the corner or something. Mm. But about the Confederate statues and such, I don't know, from the North, I just have a different perspective. I think that we're honoring people, I know I'll get in trouble for this, who waged war against the United States. I see sometimes I'm driving down the street, I see Confederate flag and a United States flag. Well, they cancel each other out. The United States flag should be enough. And I say, why isn't it enough? The other flag is divisive. and we don't have statues to other people that waged war against the United States. So, and Lincoln was very, he was very forgiving. He did not punish them as people, who, what do you call that? Treason. I think they're supposed to be shot or something like that. He didn't do that. He forgave them and all. And I really think, which was, a good thing to do, but it opened the door to all this later myths about how glorious and this and that. Slavery was wrong. Human trafficking was wrong then. It's wrong now. So I think it's fine for those statues to be in the museums and in the Confederate cemetery and such. But same thing, battlefield, same thing. But on the street, you're saying that this community is honoring this person and what they stand for. Mm-hmm. And I just have a problem with that. And I don't see, there's nothing wrong with renaming a street, because that street has been named, Robert E. Lee for 200 years? Mm-hmm. Give somebody else a chance to have their name on the street.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's, for me, has been a tension about, St. George's, as you mentioned, we're not a public place. So it's not like, and we do honor Reverend McGuire. The window behind me here, the beautiful stained glass window, was dedicated to his memory. And he did a lot to bless this parish. He was responsible for the building of the current building that we're in, and was rector for almost 50 years. So how do we remember him and remember the good things, and then also how do we remember, but not just remember those things, and that to me has been a tension. I'm curious, Luke, in your community, is there any of this conversation going on?
Yes, thank you. Well, part of what it makes me think of is more personal for our own story. We spent a lot of 2019 into 2020 looking back at our community and what we called renewing our foundations, or taking a step back to look. And it was a lot, some of it was historical, and some of it then looking at the present and looking to the future. And one of the things that came up for us was naming the importance of history of transmission, of what are the stories, some things that had been talked about more informally that the younger generation, of which I'm a part of, hadn't heard directly. So of us realizing there's some things we just do, but we don't know how long it's been done this way, or why do we do it this way. So we're learning to ask more directly, what's the history of transmission on the way we worship? What's the history of transmission on how new men are formed? What's the history of transmission of key people from our past, former, for us, superiors, for a parish, rectors, and one of the questions that we used when doing some timeline work was sharing, for all of us, what are the things we're grateful for, and what are the things we're sorry for of our corporate story, and also sort of naming where did we individually come into that story. And those are hard things they were a bit new for us to sort of begin some of those things. Not that they're brand new, but talking in that way has been some further helpful addition for us of ways to be learning to ask more. And what it made me think of in hearing what you said, John, of maybe of what I could use in my community, or what others could use, is asking, who have we honored in our past, and for what, and who by that honoring was not heard, or what was not lifted up when we lifted up this person for this reason, or this way of being, or this group. That those might be questions that I can take from this, but also for questions for others as to who is honored and who is not. That's part of what comes up for me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I'll just take this opportunity to remind our listener, our audience, that if you want to submit your questions, the Q&A function is a great way to do that. If you go to the bottom of your screen, if you're on a computer, I'm not sure exactly where it would be on a mobile device, you'll see next to the chat and the participants and your mute button and everything, something that says Q&A. Some of you have posted questions or comments that have gone just to the panelists. I'll just take a moment to just share a couple of those. Someone said that the church is honoring Native people now by including the tribes upon whose land we sit today. And that it reflects that in our prayers of the people today, we included a mention of the Patawomack and the Manahoac peoples who were on this land, before European settlement. And so that is a small step, a step among many that I hope we will take. And that's a part of our story too, even though it's not our story, but the land on which we sit is, and the painful past of how this land was inhabited by peoples for thousands upon thousands of years, and then within a few hundred years, those peoples have been greatly marginalized, and their history was even attempted to be erased. So how can we as a parish, how is that a part of our parish story, even though, as far as I've been able to learn, our parish doesn't have a whole lot of active role in that, is from a kind of from an obvious point of view, although it's all connected for sure. So another person commented just that they appreciated John's distinction about honoring and remembering, and that the question of what do we rename and what do we not rename is still something that is largely open. Some people feel like we've gone too far. Some people feel like we haven't gone far enough. So I think this question was one that it's been particularly sticking with me, and I'm curious if anybody else on the panel or if any of our other participants want to say anything more about it before we move on. Well, this might be a good way to transition to another question about humility, because I think these painful parts of our story are humbling. And I think for me, there's that tension between wanting to sort of be like, go St. George's, let's tell our great story, and then also be humble about that. So for example, in the previous example that I mentioned of, the school the church did operate a school for enslaved children. It was it had a brief life. Or the fact that one of the stories that's told about St. George's is how the church was used as a military field hospital during the Battle of Fredericksburg. To which my response is that had nothing to do with the church people. It was the fact that it was a building that was taken over by the Union Army. So the church people were gone. It's not like they were in here ministering to the soldiers. So Brother Luke, because you're and Oshin too, as monks, as men for whom humility is part of your rule of life. I'm curious how you might respond to that question of how do we tell these community stories without simply glorifying ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as you said, part of it is to try to get the story right, or who who was there with the hospital? So have we co-opted something to try to make ourselves look better by omitting key details so it makes us sound good, or something that feels like we want to claim? Whereas if we included more details, then we might not have highlighted this story, or maybe we wouldn't be telling it as much, or we would tell it, we would have to have some more intention that in telling this, that yes, this happened, and either directly we're sorry that it did happen, or it's part of the complexity of it's not something that we're proud of, but this is part of who we are, or what has happened by us or on our in our space. With communities, again, like with individuals, it's learning to say what, I think for communities, it's helpful to also then think of, how do I share about my experience, to admit my frailty, to admit my own shortcomings and what I have not done well, or what I have done that is clearly wrong, and to name that is in some ways that's normal. One of the things that I was surprised by in our rule of life, which describes who we want to be, and second to the scripture is really what shapes our teaching and all of our life, is that our rule of life is full of talking about death, loss, and falling down. That's very central, because it's central to our human experience, as opposed to getting it right, doing well, and succeeding. So part of it is to be I think it takes intentional practice that this becomes more of a way of talking about ourselves. We are taught, mostly for good reason, to focus on our successes and what we do well. That's not a bad thing, but if that is our only way of talking about ourselves, it's problematic. And the culture tends to, encourages us to focus on what is good and what we succeed at, or what we look good at. So admitting our weaknesses, admitting what we're not good at, admitting when we're wrong, and to say, I was wrong at this, and I take responsibility that whether I knew I was wrong in the midst of doing it, or not, to claim that is something that we don't see as many good examples of, or it's not encouraged by the culture. So it's, I think the church is, can be a place to practice. It's a different way of being. And that may come in part by practicing telling our corporate story, and telling it in a way that's honest about what we're sorry for, including what we're divided about. We're not sure how to tell this story, or we have strong differing opinions as to what to do about this. That in itself indicates something to the next generation, that it's not, part of the humility is admitting complexity. There's no easy answer to this. That in itself is a giving up, and can be an encouragement to one who is receiving of, oh, so if I don't have it together, or I'm not sure what to do, I could admit that. That in itself is a humble act, and an encouragement both for ourselves and for the generations to come.
Can you say again what those three things were that you're supposed to tell? Death, falling down,
And loss.
And loss. Wow. Wow. Just a different, and I think that I think our churches can be places that model that kind of, like, it's okay to tell stories about those things. Thank you. Thank you.
May I tell a story? When I was early in the community, we were putting away supper in the kitchen. I was with another brother, and I tipped over a jar of peanuts, and peanuts scattered all across the kitchen floor. And I was so embarrassed. And the older brother looked at me and said, "I'm so glad to see that." And I thought, huh? What do you mean? And he said, "You work so hard to be good and to have it all together. You dropped all the peanuts, and you will continue to drop things or not get it right. And that's okay." Which was an encouragement for me. What he was inviting there, and I've continued to be invited in here, is to be myself with my shortcomings, and that people, my brothers especially, will see that they accept me. And they also actually told me more directly, if you don't accept your own shortcomings, you can't stay. But if you do, we will love you and hold you further into life. Which has helped me on the journey, that that's what this is about, not about me getting it right.
Yeah, it's not about getting it right, but it is about being willing to admit and trust that you'll be loved anyway.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for that. Oshin, I'm curious, from a Zen monk perspective, how does this question sort of sit with you?
Yeah, hearing a story about spilled peanuts, I think, wow, that's a Zen story. That sounds like our stories. That sounds a lot like the work that we do. And that's a beautiful reminder that there's always, of course, more that unites us. There's absolutely more that unites us than divides us. I remember reading a quote when Saint Benedict formed the first monastery. He was asked by the people of the land, what is a monastery? What do you do here? And he said, we fall down and we get up. We fall down and we get up. And I like to take that teaching to heart as well and try and remember that always. Very similar to Brother Luke, that just trying to lead with vulnerability, trying to really embrace my humanness. Part of our central way of being, and what I push forward as a kind of teaching focus with No Barriers Zen, is that there's all these barriers in our life. We like to look at them a lot from accessibility and disability barriers and barrier-free environments, but we have to look at the barriers that we place within ourselves. And we spend so much time and energy running away from those barriers, not realizing, at least from a psycho-spiritual perspective, they're a door, they're a place for us to enter and to become more intimate with ourselves and to go further. And I love that. So I like collecting stories like that. I had another friend who said, don't trust a pastor without a limp. And I love that story. I love that idea that we want our leaders and our organizations to kind of lead with a vulnerability, with this kind of commitment to that, because it's welcoming to us. It feels safe to me when I know, this is a human. This is a human and a group of humans that are trying, and they want to include the whole person, and it extends beyond that. I mean, we have things in our liturgy to echo back to something that John said. The voices were there, but and similarly, as Brother Luke has exemplified, we have a part in our liturgy where we pause and say, for the names that are forgotten or left unsaid. And I love the wording of that because there was a purposefulness often to the stories that we didn't honor, that we didn't lift up, and that we didn't hold in a valuable kind of way. And when we didn't do that, they were forgotten, or they were chosen to be left unsaid. So I remember things like that. And so, yes, we need structures and communities to hold us accountable that way. And we also need the space and the commitment to do that work. We need retreats. We need Lenten time. We need those spaces to go deep and to look inside and allow for those stories that are arising in us.
Thank you. Thank you. I like what remembering. We remember those who we have forgotten to remember. I'll have to get. You'll have to send me the exact wording for that. That's beautiful. And I think one of the questions I've really been sort of holding is how the season of Lent is a season of reflection. It's also intentionally a season of self-examination and repentance. So looking at ourselves as not just as individuals, but as a community, and how do then we begin to change and acknowledge our need for change and our need for transformation. And I wonder if even just naming that we have not always remembered those that we need to remember. And we intentionally in our prayers that's a beautiful step. A follow-up to what you said, Brother Luke, Pastor Rita has sent in this question. Ruby Sales, civil rights activist Ruby Sales, has wondered what a white theology of liberation might look like. And just to clarify for folks, she's not talking about a theology of white supremacy. I think when people hear that phrase, sometimes they get jarred a little bit by it. But what she's really talking about is a theology of liberation where white people who have been held captive by their racism and by their internalized white supremacy, what does liberation look like, and what does the theology of liberation look like? Ruby Sales, just to clarify, is a Black civil rights activist. So she has wondered about this, and so Rita says, I wonder if it might include holding what you spoke about: death, loss, imperfection, and grace. How, as a community that strives to be diverse, can we hold up that alongside a theology of liberation for people of color, LGBTQ, and other marginalized groups? So that's a Rita's follow-up question to you, Brother Luke. I wonder if you've given, if that's been something you've thought about at all. How we hold the liberation of those who have been disenfranchised with also the liberation of the disenfranchisers.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Arita. I think that's a good connection. I do think the death and loss that I'm experiencing and can identify with in my own privileged experience is further healing and liberating to me, and may offer a connection for how I further seek justice for all. So my own transformation personally, and also communally in communities that experience privilege, can help us further also to transform the world as we seek justice for those who are marginalized in a variety of ways. Yes, I do think that goes together, and so, which is partly of that of paying attention to what happens for the individual, then can shape what happens for the community. Mm-hmm. Also, what impacts a community can further help how they play an active role in the world and among other communities and individuals. So the one does help inform and further impact for all people. But thank you for that connection.
Any other thoughts on how we hold our stories with humility, or how we engage in self-examination and repentance as a community? So I'll note that St. George's held a service of repentance and reconciliation back in 2013. That was the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And that will be featured as part of an exhibit that's going to be at the Fredericksburg Area Museum that's opening up on April the 3rd. Just putting in a plug for that. But and John's been really involved in helping develop that exhibit. One of the things we've tried to do is tell a larger story. John, go ahead. You had your hand up.
Well, first off, on the exhibit, I think you guys did a tremendous job in the humility department. I think you confronted a number of issues really head on, and much credit to all of you in doing that. One of the challenges we have is that not everybody sees our history, whatever that be, the congregation, the community, the nation, as we might. Everybody sees their history a little bit differently. And, and I've often, and you all have made reference to this, the challenge of a nation or community or church is very much like that of an individual. You need to remember, and not just remember selectively, but you need to remember. You need to recognize the impact of what has happened, what the consequences, and then you need to reconcile. On the base individual level, we've all, as we've mentioned, we've all failed, and we all have to do that. A lot of us don't. A lot of us choose to forget, and that's a lot. Our history, ironically, in this country is made up of kind of equal parts of remembering and equal parts of forgetting. And so it's a real challenge to challenge ourselves to remember and to see these things and to understand why people see history differently. And I would also say it's important to understand, those folks who are very devoted to icons and symbology. You don't necessarily have to agree with them, but it's worth your while to understand where that comes from. Sometimes it comes from bad places, but more often than not, it doesn't come from a dark, evil place necessarily. And to step back and kind of have that empathy as well, hard as it may be sometimes, to step back and say, okay, well, how did this kind of concept of our past come to be? And I think that's a worthwhile exercise. We have a lot of competing views of our history in our country. And I'm sure you have competing views of your history in your congregation as well. But we can't see them as competing views. We have to see them as perspectives that kind of need to be understood and addressed and work collaboratively. We'll never all be in the same place, but I think most people recognize that there isn't a single collective narrative of America like there used to be. There was, you often see this reference to a single history that unites us. Well, there are some aspects, there are certain principles in our history that hopefully unite us. But the fact is, our history is way too diverse to proclaim it as a single narrative. But to accept a world in which there are different narratives, we have to, again, you go back to the words of empathy and understanding and really work at that a little bit. So I've very much appreciated being on this panel today. It's been very inspiring to me, and in many ways kind of calming, which I think is probably is part of the point of some of the work that you all do. And I hope that kind of the calm reflection that we see here on these screens today can spread into our community and our nation, because Lord knows we need it.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I appreciate. I'm so glad to have you in the conversation. Malanna, I wanted to ask you, as a member of our history committee, and just from your own personal experience, I mean, what are you hoping will come out of telling our whole story as a community in terms of like self-examination and repentance and change and transformation?
Well, I'm hoping that people will listen to the other side, people that you don't see eye to eye with, don't agree with, that you listen to them, hear their story, their perspective. And in some instances, we have to put ourselves in another person's place. What if this was my history or what have you? And I think once that happens, people will feel, recognize the other person's humanity. And a lot of times that's what's missing. So we keep have the dialogue so people can understand where we're coming from, other people.
I'm right there with you. I hope that comes out of this too, that telling our whole story doesn't mean that people feel like the story is that all our predecessors were bad and terrible people, but that it's, we're all susceptible to, that we remember what happened, and that we continue to be in this dialogue so that we can continue to move forward and to transform and change, so that the things of the past can hopefully eventually be healed. I mean, I'm hoping for healing eventually, and I don't say that lightly or glibly, like, oh, can't we all just get along and be healed? I mean, it's hard work. And I appreciate the work that you've done and others have done in helping us at least know what these stories are, so that we can work with them. I think one of the things that that occurred to me yesterday in your session, Brother Luke, was, what would it be like to invite Jesus into these stories, into some of these hard stories of our past? What are the exercises you had us do? Was imagine Jesus in your story. And so what would Jesus is, how can we invite Christ to speak into these times that we find difficult to reckon with? And how much of that would be Jesus's grace and love for us? I'll still love you, even though you totally made a huge mess of things, and at the same time holding us accountable. And so I've been thinking about, how can we pray with our stories, our communal stories, and not just our personal stories. So that's something I'm holding and taking away from this weekend. So I think this we focused a lot on past, and I kind of want to move us more into present and future. And I think, as we've just said, we want to be a parish that is welcoming and transforming and healing, and so we have this sort of story, I think, that is told in Fredericksburg about St. George's being a welcoming place. You mentioned that earlier, Malanna, and and so a big question that comes up is around accessibility, and what does that welcome really mean? It's one thing to say we're welcoming, but then there can be a lot of barriers, like you mentioned, Oshin. And I'm wondering what would you say to us as a community that is striving to be welcome and have that be a part of our story now and in the future?
Yeah, what a lovely thing to put at the center is welcoming. How do we be a church for all people? How do we make ourselves welcoming in this way? As a deaf person, as a person who also has mobility limitations, I walk with canes sometimes, and even getting invited into a 300-year-old parish. And my first thought is, how old's the building? What am I going to have to climb over? How am I going to get in? How am I going to get there? It's an active question. And so on a personal level, you feel that. you feel that. And does that make you feel welcome? Does that make you feel like, hey, if this building wasn't even designed for me, it's very obvious I don't have a seat at the table. And that echoes throughout, and because then we don't see those people at the table, they're not included. Their stories aren't heard, their voice isn't heard. But I was really delighted, to come into St. George's a few years ago and find the ramps and find the interpreters and find the services and have those questions asked of me. What would make you feel more welcome here? What are we doing? How, can we do this better? It was an attitude and a spirit of openness and inclusivity and a commitment to a process. One of my kind of sidelines is I also help churches, temples, mosques, different organizations become more accessible. And that's one of the key things I always try and hit home is it has to be a commitment to a process. One of the things that makes me afraid is it's like, oh, we already did that. We had a committee, we had a conversation, and we decided we are now inclusive. And it's great, and I'm so happy that that happened. But it has to be an ongoing story, a commitment to accessibility, and keep asking ourselves, what stories do we have? What beliefs do we have? What are we ready to let go of? What are we ready to shift? What is our core attitude, opinion, belief, focus of our ministry if, we have these other things in the way, with liberation theology and white liberation theology was mentioned. Most of disability theology, modern disability theology, which is something that's not even really been discussed until recently, all stems out of liberation theology on the Christian side for sure. And I find that really powerful and interesting. That's what it's couched in. This is what we're saying. This is what we're talking about when we talk about all people and this way of thinking and being. Because even myself, as a person that holds these multiple identities, I'll put myself in a box. I'll uphold a label. I'll tell a certain story. I'm not even sure I believe anymore about myself. But it's the story. It's the role I've been asked to play. Well, let's be this guy in this space, So I think that's always the big thing I really try and hit home is I'm allowed to be open and to re-examine those parts of myself and ask of a space, of a faith community, of a university, of a place of employment, what I need. And I get to ask myself that. And it gets to be a narrative, a story about myself that changes. We talk about loss and death and that story. In Buddhism, we say, old age, sickness, and death. These are the three things that we basically, it's our death and taxes. We all have them. We can't avoid this, kind of conversation. But it's so interesting to us and to me from my side of the aisle, when this is a central focus and commitment, how little has actually been done. If we say old age, sickness, and death are a part of our story, it's a part of our narrative in life. And disability is the one minority we're all going to visit. We're all probably going to experience either temporarily or permanently at some stage in our life disability. And that's going to affect our identity and how we interact with institutions. So how do we be welcoming? It usually starts with not othering ourselves and including our own stories and making space for that and being present to that. And knowing that, if we're going to have this conversation, who's at the table? What names are forgotten or left unsaid? Is there somebody representing here? And do they have the room to change their story as well? Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful words. And I, while you were, before you even said that, Pastor Rita sent a question that just follows up on that wonderfully, which is, how do we work to invite people that don't often find themselves as storytellers in that role in a community to become comfortable becoming storytellers in a community. So it's one thing for us to welcome people into our community and say, hey, sit there and we're going to tell you our story and we're so glad you're here. But then at some point, they have to become part of the storytelling as well. They have to. And so how do we invite people to do that? I mean, I've tried to, I guess, no, you answer it and then I'll say something. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure if I have an answer. That's dangerous territory. But yeah, I think that we have to do a lot of really good work on ourselves and a really good modeling as clergy. You know, we've heard this echoed from a historical perspective, from even a liturgical perspective, and it has to be personal work too. So we have to hold ourselves accountable, like that white liberation theology. Like, what am I doing? You know, what am I doing here? And then by making that space, you know, and a commitment again and again to this being an ever-evolving thing, so that when we look back in 5, 10, multi-generational work that we have to do. My organization is 5 years old. It's not 300 years old. It's 5 years old. And we're rewriting our bylaws, our grievancy policies, all of these things, because as social justicely minded as we are, as committed to this, it's our core value. This is what we founded ourselves for, to do this kind of work. In 5 years, our perspectives have changed a lot. You know, so it's that commitment always, it's also that commitment always to be open to that change, you know, to hold it very loosely in some ways, for it to be central but held loosely. It's challenging work, yeah.
Thank you for that. I know for me, that's something I just have to, just even remembering to ask the question, who are the storytellers that aren't at the table, and whose stories we need to be including, you know, I think, and how to then help those people feel comfortable telling their stories, not just say, hey, you look like someone whose story we need to hear. Get up here and tell your story. That can be a very vulnerable thing to put somebody in that position, you know, and so, you know, how do we build the trust, you know, that this is we really want to hear your story. We really want you to become a storyteller of our community. You know, that's another thing for it. I think establishing trust is there's an unspoken sort of trust that has to exist between a storyteller and a story and a community. You know, if you don't trust the storyteller, then, you know, the story's is no good. As we're sort of moving forward in, you know, and we can continue to reflect on that particular question, but I think, you know, as we look to the story of where we go from here and what we hope emerges, you know, in our story, you know, friends, panelists, what would you say to St. George's? What would you say to us about what we should be paying attention to, and being mindful of?
Joe, I think that your church and the National Park Service, for example, share some of the same challenges. And that is, and you just spoke about it, is trust and the faith of certain components or elements of our community to embrace and tell the story holistically and fairly. Ours is a little bit different than yours, but you know, that's just something that's, you talk to generational change. That's, you got to have, just do the right thing over and over and over again. That's all we can do, is the right thing, and do it as well as we possibly can. And if we know it's the right thing, over time, we just need to stick to it. And eventually the walls will come down, but we have to be patient, and we can't think it's going to be an app who's going to solve our problems, or a program here or there, or a service of reconciliation, here, or, a program on slavery downtown Fredericksburg. That's not how it works. There's a whole system of trust that needs to be built between excluded parts of our community and the parts of the community that have traditionally told the stories. And that's going to be a long, hard process.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think you're just remembering that. Yeah, it's not, it's an ongoing generational work. It's our life's work and beyond us. The story goes on.
I think it's some in terms of you're turning both to those who are younger, also to those who are older. I mean, looking to different aspects of those who are in the room and inviting that, and some that it's not necessarily big events, as you mentioned, Joe, of the sort of different places for the story. I mean, to have the more informal and smaller conversations of asking to hear, where are you coming from? How do you understand where we've been? What have you, asking perhaps more to the elders, what have you experienced? What are the changes? What are you sorry for? What are you grateful for? Asking younger or newer to the community, what do you see? What would make you feel more welcome, but what is your story? And which that in itself can be the welcoming act of, who are you? We're glad you're here. What's your story? What do you bring? And welcome to the table to show yourself, your culture, your perspective. I want to get to know you. And we're grateful because you then enrich us as being a part of us. And that's, I'm finding, even just on like our communal scale of 13 brothers living together, constantly trying to, there are some who have more authority or more experience. Benedict told us to look to pay attention to the newest member or the youngest members of the community. So always looking to try to invite and ask those who, for various reasons, have less voice, and to not, or to look for those who are more neglected or overlooked. But that is, even for me, that's a constant intentional thing for those who I more naturally turn to and listen to, and trying to then go against my inclinations. Who have I not heard from? What do they have to say to this?
Thank you for that reminder of Benedict's advice, and it's very biblical, because the Bible is filled with stories of the people that no one would have asked, and then those are the ones who get lifted up as the exemplars in many cases. Well, Lena, you were going to say something.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add to what John was saying about ongoing generational thing. Well, when he said that, I thought about the voting rights, because I think in 1868, was it the 15th Amendment was passed for voting? 1870, whatever. So anyway, it's been an ongoing thing for Black Americans and marginalized people. They had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and they said, oh, now that progression has occurred, so there's no need for that. But as soon as that happened, there were all these states, adding all these different, different things, to make it hard for people to vote, shutting down voting centers and all kinds of different things. So it's, I don't know, I kind of look at Black Americans as the freedom fighters, or the people who fight for equality, because it's a constant thing for us. It's not like it's over. And when I was a kid and they passed all these laws, and I said, oh my God, it's over. Everybody's equal. Everything's fine now. But no, it's not the case. So it's something that we have to always be aware of and always strive to achieve, to maintain this. So it's generational. So maybe someday, you know, it may not be a need for that, but right now it just keeps going on.
How do you think that relates to us at St. George's, as far as like, how do we continue as we you know, imagine what our story looks like even 10 years from now or 20 years from now? You know, how does that struggle factor into our story, you think?
Well, I'm hoping you know, that both sides of the aisle have made progress toward a multi-cultural, multiracial cultural democracy. That's what we should be, because everyone in the country is needed, is valuable. We're all valuable. We're all God's people, and I'm hoping that next generation things will be a lot better compared to the March in Selma and what was it, 1968, when Martin Luther King had the march in Washington. It was mostly Black people. There were some white people there too. But with Black Lives Matter, what happened over the summertime, there were a lot more white people out there. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, yay, you know, they understand. They're, you know, they recognize our humanity and that, you know, we're due equal opportunity, equal treatment. And yet, you know, we see the violence with the police shooting unarmed people continue to happen. So it gives me hope to see that mm-hmm. I feel people are more in tune and really want to see more inclusive society, and with the LGBTQ people as well.
Mm-hmm. So one of our attendees asked this question. I think it ties in a little bit with what we've been talking about, what you were saying, Malanna, too. In listening today, it sounds like stories allow us to put on a new pair of glasses and see things in a different way. Is there a way that we can tell a fictional story that opens the discussion to build new roads in our story? Who are our road builders? And when you were describing, you know, it's sort of like seeing things get better, it made me think, Malanna, like, you know, sometimes I want to tell a story of what I hope things will look like, you know, down the road. I want to say, you know, or maybe I want to tell a story, you know, about a church that successfully bridged the gap between, you know, the left and the right, you know, and was able to have, you know, these transformative and healing conversations in the midst of political division. And maybe it would help to tell a fictional story, to envision what that might look like, and then seek to live into it. I don't know, as a writer, maybe you have some.
Yes, I think I did that with my book, but just what Charles Dickens did. When he wrote A Christmas Carol, if you can remember that story. What did we do with the poor? And at the end of the story, he gave, what's his name?
Scrooge.
No, Scrooge, not Scrooge, but Scrooge gave his employer more money.
Right.
Employee, more money.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and he was going to help the little boy. And the answer is to give. Yeah. The answer is to give, not be stingy and mind this, mind that, but to open your heart and be more inclusive. And a smile was put on Scrooge's face at the end of the story because he was happy to give it. It had a fulfilling experience for him as well. So the answer is to listen, love thy neighbor. I mean, the basic lessons we learn, we just don't apply them. You know, a lot of people leave their religion at the door. They go and worship, and then when they go out in their business world or whatever, they're cutthroat, they do this and that. They don't carry those values with them when they live. They only give it to people they know and like. When it's somebody else that they don't know, whatever, it's it's a whole different story. They're treated differently. So
I think glad you mentioned that. I mean, because that certainly wasn't necessarily a reflection of something that maybe had happened, but it's how he wanted it to be. He imagined that that's a way that it could be.
yes.
Someone like a Scrooge could do that. Yeah. And it reminds me too that like someone told me, said, well, if you don't have a good story for a sermon, just make one up. Because it's about the envisioning of it, not necessarily that it actually happened.
And sometimes stories are powerful. Words can change. What is that lady's name that had the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin? Remember when, Harriet Beecher Stowe and Abraham Lincoln said, "You're the little lady that started this war." So she, her book got a lot of people thinking about ending slavery because they could relate to certain characters in the book about their experiences. It's brought home to them the humanity that people have. Right.
And I think that's very biblical too. You look at stories like the book of Esther, for example, which, pretty much everybody agrees is not a historic story, but it's a story about how one person can change the course of history, by their courage and their willingness to, stand up. And so was that story written in a time of exile by people who were sort of, hoping that, this would be the case? So great question. Thank you to whoever posted that. One of our anonymous attendees, it said. But yeah, it's something to ponder. What role do fictional stories have to play in where our story goes from here? Yeah. Another question has come in. What role does the fear of not enough play in the turmoil, and should it be a clearer part of the story? So that's from Marcia. And I guess I'm going to try to interpret that a little bit. What role does the fear of not enough? And so I think that in a lot of cases in our story, there's this fear that there's just not going to be enough of whatever it is. There's, if we make ourselves more accessible, well, then there's not going to be enough, history. If we punch a hole in the side of the church to put in an access ramp, well, then, there's not going to be enough money to do that, or there's not going to be enough focus on the history, or there's not going to be enough, room for X, Y, or Z. What role does that have to play in the turmoil that we have around transformation and change, and how do we address that in our story? And what a theme in basically all the story, in so many of the great stories. Not enough is like the presenting problem. Once upon a time there was not enough, and then something happened. Luke.
I think that relates to as we seek to change, what is the inherent loss here? There often, as we seek for a greater good or to live into living a certain way, then there is a loss. There's a limitation. What I hear in that question is that it's important for that to be named. We are seeking healing, we're seeking further freedom, but to do so usually comes with further limitation of some sort. If we are to change, we will lose something. It's one thing to say, well, let's just go this way. This will be healing. This is good for us. That is true, and we will lose something, even if we will lose the status quo, the way we are used to behaving. To name that is a loss that comes with change, and to grieve what is a loss, even if it's something that's good to let go of, it's still hard to let go of. So I think that's a very important question. The not enough, the loss, is key to all of this. And sometimes we can overlook that or deny the reality of what is being let go of as we take on something new or try to change.
Yeah, Thank you. I think that I'm looking forward to listening to this conversation again. We're recording it because there's so many things I want to write down later when I have time. But I think, you know, as a culture, we're not good at telling that story. Like everything's got to be better, and it's going to be, you know, more prosperous, and it's just we're always heading to a brighter thing. But then there's not that recognition that with that will come some loss. Something will be lost, that doesn't have to be bad, but it is going to be a loss. Are there any other questions from our attendees? We're getting close to our hour. We're going to stop at 4 o'clock. So just want to make sure if folks want to post any more questions in the Q&A that you do that. It's been such a rich conversation. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate this chance to be in dialogue. And Malanna, I'll just note that I know we've got Stuart with you there. I've heard him in the background, so please thank him for chiming in with us. It's great to have him as a part of this too. So somebody posted a question. The excellent PBS documentary on the Black church quoted MLK saying that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of the week. How do we make our church family more inclusive? It's a great question. Goes back to our question around welcome and how does our story, hey Stuart, how does our story isn't just a story of inclusivity and welcome, but how do we practically do that? So I open that up to my friends here at the table. In other words, we've got this story that we want to tell, but how do we walk the talk? But it also kind of ties in with a greater story about why this is the most segregated hour in America. You know, there's stories going back. I mean, I think about the story of Absalom Jones in the Episcopal Church, who was in Christ Church in Philadelphia, which was an integrated church, a Methodist Episcopal church in the colonial era. And then one day the white members of that church suddenly decided that all of the Black members had to sit in the balcony, you know, and so they left en masse and started what became the African Methodist Episcopal Church under Absalom Jones stayed with the Episcopal Church, but under, help me remember his name, Richard Allen, became the founder of the AME Church, and so, you know, that's part of the history of why this is the most segregated hour in America. But John, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say that it remains the most segregated hour in America as a reflection of all that we have discussed today, and all the deep divisions, the mistrust, and it just goes back again to that building of trust again in any organization, including, you know, the federal government. As in the National Park Service, we face the exact same issue. I'll share just a quick story. A couple of years ago, in fact, Stuart, who's faded into the background of his wife's picture there, Stuart and I were on a tour in Fredericksburg, and we were doing a tour of the Black churches in town, and I was the only white person on the tour. We went to bunches of sites. And we were in our Park Service uniforms. Stuart happens to work for the Park Service. And I had finished at a stop, and we were kind of milling around, and an older gentleman came over to me, and he pulled me aside because he didn't want to say anything in front of the rest of the group. And he said, "Are you going to get in trouble for doing this?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "I didn't think you were allowed to do this. I didn't think you were allowed to talk about this stuff." And it occurred to me, I mean, it was a revelatory moment, because I realized at that moment just how wide the chasm is, how there is embedded belief that we not only are not trustworthy enough to tell a broader story, but aren't allowed to tell a broader story. Now, how long is it going to take to overturn that conception in this community? And, honestly, any organization like the Park Service that's been here a long time, like St. George's, confronts the exact same issue of trust. But for me, that was stunning, a stunning revelation of how deep the divide is. And I think, we've narrowed it some over the years, but it's going to be, I'll be dead and gone, and we'll still be talking about this issue, unfortunately.
And Charlie piped in and said, "Is that the wrong question to ask?" And so that there's a question to say, is being inclusive, that in itself, is about a story, right? Of the white people wanting to feel like we're including other people in us, and does that really honor people where they are? It's a good question to ask, Charlie.
Well, Joe.
Yeah.
Well, I was with John that time, and I've done some further talking with the people in the community. And the fact was, they thought both of us were going to get in trouble for that. And based on the history of Fredericksburg, they were never taught that in school. And I mean, even to this day, when I still talk to people in Fredericksburg, they just said they only taught about the Confederacy. They were never taught about any Black soldiers in the Civil War or anything about slavery. And in fact, when I became a park ranger, and just before we were going to do this tour, I asked my great aunt, if she could tell me some stories about slavery, because her father, who was the associate minister of Shiloh New Site, was a slave. And she refused to tell me, and she was my favorite great aunt. And she always would talk to me, but she would refuse to talk about slavery or anything about the Civil War. So that's how deep it was in this community. And in fact, there was one time this year I spoke out in the same question. And then what John said, I can remember last June, we had one of the city councilmen come in and talk to the park. And I told him, I said, in 1968, I protested as a sophomore in high school about all of these same events. That was 52 years ago, and we're still having the same conversation.
So I think that's a good word to maybe to end on, is that these stories are stories that we're going to tell again and again. The conversations, just because we're having the same conversation doesn't mean we're not going anywhere. Just because we're telling the same story doesn't mean we're not heading anywhere. But hopefully every time we have the conversation, every time we tell the story, we're learning, we're growing. And in my response to the question of inclusivity, or just how do we even just try to make it so that churches are less segregated than they are, I think the stories are so important. Being able to listen to each other's stories in the community, and try to be make it clear that we're a community that wants to hear your story, and not just tell you our story, is really. But it kind of goes back to what we said about building trust between the storyteller and trusting. Building that trust that, if you hear my story, that you're gonna respect it, and that you're gonna hold it with care, and you're gonna hold it as sacred. Oh gosh, well, I wish we could keep going, but it's time for us to close. So just so y'all know, Stuart Henderson, there with Malanna, is another member of St. George's, and has done some wonderful work for the Park Service. And is a historian, and is a reenactor. Both he and Malanna are reenactors and sort of visual storytellers as well in their own way. So we're glad you could join us for this last little bit, Stuart.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you friends who joined this today. So John, Malanna, Oshin, Luke, it's been just a real honor to have your wisdom and insights here as part of this conversation. Thank you for taking the time to think about, what we were going to talk about ahead of time and to share in this context. I want to invite Brother Luke to invite Brother Lucas on the screen for just a moment if he's available, because we want to thank him as well for this entire Lenten weekend that we've been having. So let me just begin by saying I just want to call out Reverend Arita Bridgmahan and Laurel Loke, who with me we've been working to pull together the Lenten weekend for the past several months, and I'm so grateful to Arita and Laurel for their leadership. I want to thank our interpreters Diane and Aaron for helping to make this event accessible today, and I think for me this is an important way of just expanding our story, the fact that this story of this conversation has been told in another language at the same time that we are hearing it in English. We're also seeing it being rendered in a different way is really powerful to me. So thank you all. And thank you, Brother Luke and Brother Lucas, for a weekend's worth of stories and prayer and reflecting on so many things about what it means to tell stories and hear stories and the power of stories for healing in our lives and the role of God and Jesus and all of that. It's been a wonderful experience, and we're so sorry you couldn't join us here in Fredericksburg in person, but we're so glad that we could connect with you. And you've done a wonderful job of leading us in this virtual format.
You're welcome. Great to be with you, and blessings to you from all of us, brothers.
Wonderful. Well, I certainly hope that our paths will continue to cross. And thank you. Thank you to all of you who attended today. I'm really impressed. We started out with 35 participants. We still have 33. You all have hung on for over 2 hours. So thank you for joining us for this event. I will just put in a plug and say we have a couple of other webinar events that are coming up. John Hennessy will be back with us in just a couple of weeks. And our history committee is going to be presenting a webinar a week from this Tuesday on March the 9th, I believe. And then John, I believe, is the following Tuesday on March the 16th. Did I get that right, John? Is that right? Okay, so that's Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, another webinar. And again, more stories of St. George's and our history, but also story. John, do you want to say a little bit, John, about what you're going to talk about?
Sure. My goal is to put the experience of St. George's in the context of the community's experience in the mid-19th century as it grappled with the institution of slavery and its future and war in its midst.
Great. Well, we look forward to that. So again, on behalf of all of us here at St. George's, I hope that this weekend and this conversation today enriches your story and inspires you to in the hearing and in the telling of stories to see God at work in that in a healing and transformative way. So may you go in peace and love and service and under the cover of God's grace and love. Thanks be to God.
Thank you.